Hey crafty fam, it's Alex Vanover and welcome back to my craft room. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to put UV resin on acrylic blanks just like this. It's really fun and really easy, but UV resin is not like using epoxy. So if you've never used UV resin before, there's a couple things you need to know about it before we get started. So first, there's no mixing involved. It comes in a little bottle like this and there's no mixing required. So it's much more expensive in like per the quantity, but you're not going to use as much as you do with epoxy. So I'll explain it all when we get to the acrylic. But another thing you need to know is that you do need a UV lamp in order to cure your UV resin. Now you'll hear some crafters say that they can just put it in the sun to let it cure, but that is weather dependent and I don't recommend relying on that because if you have a really cloudy day, you may not be able to finish your project. So I'll be sure to update my Amazon store with all the products that I use so that you can check out the ones that I like to use. But because you cure it with a UV lamp, that means that you're gonna have your project done and cured in a couple of minutes instead of a couple of hours. So it's really, really neat to learn how to use it. And as I've learned to make UV resin projects for acrylic blanks, I prefer UV resin now over epoxy. So let's get started and I'll show you what to do. Okay, crafty fam, so for starters, here is the UV resin that I'm going to be using today. I will link this from Amazon. This is where I get it. If you type in UV resin, there are tons and tons of options, and some are great and some are not so great. So I've been liking this one, so I will be sure to create a new category in my Amazon store for you guys so that you can access all of my favorite supplies for UV resin projects. So keep in mind, like I was telling you about before, UV resin is different than epoxy, so you're not gonna have to mix anything. Everything comes in this little bottle. But I'm gonna be honest with you, the smell is strong, quite strong. So, you know, if that's something that bothers you, you may want to be cautious about that when using UV resin. So the way that I always like to use UV resin is I prefer to mix my glitter into my UV resin. I've never gotten good results with applying the UV resin and then adding the glitter afterwards. The application is just never smooth for me. So I like to put some in a medicine cup or a portion cup. You're not measuring, so it doesn't matter, but I just like to pour some out because I'm going to be doing a couple of layers of UV resin, so I want to put a fair amount in my little medicine cup here. And then you want to go ahead and start adding your glitter. So there's no magic recipe for this. You just want to go a little bit at a time, and then I'll show you how to tell when you've added enough. Oh, and I am using from Starcraft Glitter Vitamin C. I love, love, love this color. So once you start to mix in a little bit, you're going to go ahead and mix it around with your popsicle stick. And you'll start to see what the glitter is going to look like when you put it on the acrylic. But when you want to figure out how dense your glitter is going to be on your acrylic, you want to pick it up off that popsicle stick and then look at it that way. And that's really going to give you a good picture of what it's going to look like when it goes onto the acrylic. That's not quite dense enough for me, so I'm going to go ahead and add some more. I like my glitter to be really, really, really obvious, so I like to almost overdo it and see how much glitter I can add to my UV resin. But everyone's style is different, and that's fine. So that's a little more like what I'm talking about, especially because I'm going to add a couple of layers of UV resin to my acrylic, so I'm going to get to layer this a little bit and maybe even make it a little bit darker. So I think that's probably going to be fine. So I'm going to set this aside, and UV resin doesn't cure literally until it's under the UV light. So you're not really under a time restriction, which is nice. Now I'm just going to use my pen to peel up one side of the protective film over my acrylic. I'm going to leave the other side there because I'm going to put my vinyl on the other side, and I don't want to get any glitter or UV resin on that side just yet. So once I'm done with that, I'm not going to use my popsicle stick just because I don't think it's precise enough. I'm going to actually use a small paintbrush that looks like this. My favorite paintbrushes you actually get from Walmart, but because I'm in quarantine, I cannot go to Walmart to get my favorite paintbrushes. But any small paintbrush will do. Then you're just going to start putting the UV resin around your acrylic. If you have seen my video about using epoxy with acrylics, this is a very similar method. I basically just take it all the way to the edge with my paintbrush. You want to try not to go over the edge, but the UV resin does have a little bit of surface tension like epoxy does. So if you take it all the way to the edge, it shouldn't go over on its own, which is nice. That makes it a lot easier on you. So I'm just gonna go all the way around, and then I'll go back and add some in the middle. If you do get some that drips over the side, you can use things like sandpaper to get it back off again. That's what I would recommend. But keep in mind that because your UV resin doesn't cure until you put it under the UV lamp, if you notice some dripping before you even put it in the lamp, you can always go back with like a baby wipe and try to wipe it off the side before you ever put it in the lamp. But you do risk messing up your acrylic, so you can either wipe it off before you put the acrylic in the UV lamp, or you can wait until it's already cured, and then you can go back with a baby wipe and fix it then. So you want to be really careful around the whole of your acrylic. And then I'm just going to go back in and basically paint in the center. UV resin, whoops, I kind of dripped. It dripped down the side there. So that's one of those instances where I can use my glove to get off the side. UV resin does have some similar self-leveling properties like epoxy does. So you can kind of dab it on there, and then if you give it some time, it will do a lot of the leveling for you. So then once you think you've got it, one tip that I like to use is I always have a lot of bright light near me when I'm using UV resin and epoxy, and I'm actually gonna get down eye level with my acrylic and see if there's any spots where I didn't take the UV resin all the way to the edge, or if there's anywhere that's got any major bubbles or anything. But that actually looks pretty good to me. You can kind of use the light to your advantage to tell whether there's any areas that need to get some extra love before you put it in the lamp. So this is the UV lamp that I use, which is also from Amazon. This is a 48 watt lamp, and I would not go any smaller than 48 watts. The thing you have to remember when you order on Amazon is there are a lot of nail lamp options. So I'm gonna link this one in my Amazon store for you guys as well, because you want at least around 50 watts so that you make sure that it has enough power to actually cure your UV resin. Okay, so mine also has a removable top, which I like, because then I can just take my acrylic very carefully and place it in the bottom of my UV lamp. That way I don't have to slide it or really do anything like that. We're gonna do multiple coats, so if you mess it up a little bit, that's okay. Then you're gonna put your top back on the lamp. Now I'm gonna let it go for 60 seconds. And then we'll do our next coat of UV resin. Alright, and I did forget that typically I like to put a little bit of a cover over top of my lamp while it's curing, so sometimes I'll take a little piece of cardstock and kind of make a little bit of a tent over it just to protect my eyes from getting too much UV exposure. We may need, I typically like to do like a second, like 2 minutes of curing before I do my second coat, just because I want to make sure that my base coat is completely dry. So let's do 1 more minute and then we'll add some more UV resin. Oh my gosh, you guys, so look what I did. Don't be like me. So I left my my clear medicine cup way too close to my UV lamp while it was curing, and I cured all my UV resin in the side of my medicine cup. So make sure that you set that plenty far away. Most UV resin is in a dark bottle like this so that it doesn't get UV cured, so you want to keep that away from your lamp as well, but that's not quite as much something to worry about. So because I am goofy, I'm going to mix up a little more UV resin. So that's feeling pretty good already, actually. I'll probably do at least 1 more coat just to make sure that I get a really, really smooth result out of my UV resin. I would recommend that you do 2 to 3 coats of UV resin by the time it's all said and done, especially on the glitter side. On the side where it's just vinyl, you may not need to use quite as much, but you just want to make sure that you have good coverage with no bubbles, and typically, kind of like epoxy, UV resin is good if you want to build coverage. So I really like to do that to make sure that I have a good, even coat of glitter without a lot of bubbles in it. So I'm going to try to make sure that I make the glitter a similar density in this UV resin. I definitely need a little bit more. And if it ends up where you put so much glitter in your UV resin that it actually changes the texture and starts to become kind of gooey, you can just add a little more UV resin to balance it out. So that's nice and dense. I think that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and use my paintbrush again and paint on another layer of glitter and UV resin. It gets a little tricky the second time around to tell where you've put your UV resin and where you haven't yet. So I like to get down eye level again with my acrylic so that I can kind of use the light to see where the UV resin looks extra shiny in places where it isn't cured yet. And that's how I can tell where I've painted and where I haven't. And now I'll just go through and fill in the middle again. You want to work in a lot thinner layers with UV resin than you do with epoxy. So make sure to spread it out well so that you're not having these big bubbly layers, which I guess you can do, but you're just going to end up having to cure it more times before you can add more layers. So again, now that I am fully covered with my UV resin, I'm gonna get down at eye level and look for any spots that have any puckering or anything like that. And if I see that, what I'll do is I'll just put some UV resin on my paintbrush and then just kind of dab in that spot to fill it in. All right, I think that looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna set my UV resin way off to the side while I bring my UV lamp in a little bit closer to cure my acrylic once again. Oh, and I'm working over a silicone baking sheet. Obviously, I never use this for food because this is specifically for using UV resin and epoxy, but just like epoxy, you can peel UV resin off of silicone even after it's cured. So that way, if I spill any on my sheet like this, after I cure it with the UV lamp, I can literally just peel it back off and clean it again. So that's why I like to work over top of silicone. So I'm just gonna very carefully pick this up and try to keep it level as much as you can. That way you're not tipping it too much. And then put my lamp back down. I always have trouble lining this thing up. Gosh. And then I'm gonna do another 60 seconds and possibly another 120 seconds after this one is over. So we'll do one more 60-second round before I move on. You really can't over cure your UV resin, which is the nice thing about it. The more times that you do it underneath the lamp, it's just gonna either get a little harder if it's not fully set or stay the same. So it's not gonna hurt you to do a couple extra rounds of UV resin, or of UV light on your UV resin. So the nice thing about UV resin is that doing multiple rounds under the UV light doesn't really hurt the UV resin. Of course, you don't want to be super excessive, but if you want to cure your epoxy or your UV resin a couple extra times while it's underneath the lamp, it's not going to hurt anything and you're not going to damage anything by doing a couple extra rounds. So that's one thing that makes it a lot easier to deal with than epoxy. It's just a lot more user-friendly in my opinion and harder to mess up. So my UV resin feels a little warm, but actually I think that looks really pretty smooth. You don't really see a lot of dimples or anything in it, so I'm pretty happy with those two semi-thick rounds of UV resin. So now I'm gonna flip my acrylic over and take off the film from the backing. See, this is why I left the backing on the other side of the acrylic, because that way I'm not gonna have to deal with trying to get this off to put my vinyl on top of it. So now that I have my paper covering off of the other side of the acrylic, I'm actually gonna apply my vinyl, and then we're gonna apply some clear UV resin without any glitter in it, just to make sure that the front side has the same like bubble feeling that the back side does that's covered in glitter. So I'm gonna apply my first layer of vinyl. This guy just doesn't want to come off the backing. There we go. So I'm just going to center this the best I can and put this over top. So again, this is the back side layer that doesn't have any glitter or anything on it yet. So after I burnish it a little bit, I'll remove my transfer tape and add my second layer. I've got a little bit of a bubble in my paw print, so I'm actually going to take my pin pen and just poke my pin pen into the vinyl and see if I can let the air out for that bubble. So I couldn't get that bubble to go all the way out of my vinyl, so I'm just gonna try to use my name to strategically cover that area of my decal. There we go. So now I can peel off my transfer tape. And then the last step to finishing up my acrylic is just adding some clear UV resin on top of this vinyl. So like I said, I can make the texture, it has a little bit of like a bubbled up texture on the back from the UV resin, and I just want to match that on the front. So I'm going to get a brand new medicine cup and a brand new paintbrush and just put clear UV resin over top the side with the vinyl on it. Alright, so now I'm going to take my brand new medicine cup and add in some clear UV resin. So I'm not going to put any glitter or anything in this layer because I just want to protect my vinyl and have it match the texture of the backside of my acrylic. And I'm also using a brand new paintbrush because in my opinion, no matter how hard you try, you're just not going to be able to clean all the glitter and UV resin out of old paintbrushes or old medicine cups. So to me, it's not worth it. I just go ahead and start over. Then I'm going to follow the same procedure that I did on the back side with this UV resin. Okay, after I think that my coverage is good, I'm gonna give it just a minute to self-level a little bit, and then we'll put it in the UV lamp and do the same thing that we did with the glitter side. have the hardest time. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna do it for 2 rounds of 60 seconds. All right, now it's time to add another layer. So far, it's looking pretty good. The first layer is a little bit thin. When the UV resin doesn't have any glitter in it, it's a little bit thinner than it does when you're working with the glitter side. So I just like to do 2 to 3 coats, usually closer to 3, to make sure that both sides feel the same. So now I'm gonna add a little bit of the UV resin straight from the UV resin bottle, just to make sure that I get the middle all filled in. Since I'm not mixing it up, I can just add it straight from the bottle, which is really nice. Here we go. So now I'm just gonna check to see if it looks level, and check out any areas that have any like puckering or anything. Any areas where I see any little bubbles, I'm just gonna dot my paintbrush and try to get rid of them. And I think that looks pretty darn good, so I'm gonna put it back in the UV lamp and do another 2 60-second rounds. All right. I think that ended up pretty smooth. There's not a lot of bubbles in it or anything, and it feels about the same on both the front and back side. So now, if you are finished with this, you could add in your keychain hardware and be good to go. If you have any other questions about using UV resin, make sure to drop those in the comments for me because you know that I'd be happy to answer them. And if you haven't already, please click right here to subscribe to DIY Alex and scroll down just a little bit so that you can ring the bell notification. And when you click the bell, make sure to select all so that means you get all notifications every single time I post a new upload. I hope we can craft again soon.